Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot returned, something buried under his porch. Elias Turner had lived alone for 17 long years with nothing but the wind and the cattle to keep him company. But one winter night, something stirred beneath his porch, a silver ring, the very one he buried beside his wife's grave long ago, now lying in the snow as if returned by unseen hands. Then came the tracks too wide, too deep for any man. And in the moonlit trees, a shadow vast and breathing, Elias gripped his rifle yet found himself lowering it instead, because what stood before him did not bring harm. It brought back pieces of a life he thought lost forever. Some legends haunt the wilderness, but others heal. Opening. That night, when memories returned, the wind swept across the snow-covered valley, threading through the pines like the weeping of the wild. Amid that cold, white silence, a small wooden cabin stood alone, its faint lantern glow only strong enough to push back the darkness a few steps from the porch. Inside, Elias Turner sat by the fire. His hands were calloused from years of labor, his eyes dimmed by time and solitude. 17 winters had passed since the day he lost his wife and son. 17 winters since he dug a small hole beneath the porch and laid to rest Mary's silver wedding ring, as though he could bury the sorrow that had worn his soul thin. But that night, memory came knocking. It began with the softest sound wood creaking just beyond the porch. In the corral, the horses stirred restless, their breath rising sharp in the cold. Elias reached for his rifle, the instinct of a man of the West still alive in him, though his heart was heavy from years of silence. Slowly he pulled open the heavy wooden door. There, beneath the snow, something glimmered under the pale moonlight. Elias bent down. His breath caught as his fingers closed around it. A ring. That ring. The silver band itself. The very same, still etched with 3 familiar letters, MTT. Mary Turner, the woman who once made this cabin a home, before fate had taken it all away. The old man's knees weakened. Behind him, the firelight flickered across his weathered face, showing the deep lines of a man standing between belief and disbelief. Then another sound, a sharp crack, the snap of a heavy branch echoing from the woods. Elias raised his head, and through the drifting veil of moonlit mist, a figure appeared, massive, towering, its breath rising in white clouds. Not a bear, not a man. Elias stood frozen. The shape did not move closer. It only watched, silent, patient, as though it had just returned something that did not belong to the frozen earth. And that night, Elias Turner understood he had never been truly alone. Part 1. Tracks in the snow. Dawn crept slowly across the Montana Valley, carrying a pale, cold light, like a thin cloth stretched over mountains and forest. Snow had fallen through the night, covering every trail around the cabin, burying the old wagon marks and the prints of his horse. Elias Turner pulled the heavy coat across his shoulders, tugged on his worn leather gloves, and stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned beneath his boots, the dry cracks sharp in the silence, like bones breaking. The morning air was thick with frost, so bitterly cold that each breath curled white around the gray beard at his chin. His old horse, tied near the corral, shifted uneasily, its mane crusted with snow ears raised, as if listening to something unseen. Elias patted its neck to calm it, though he knew the animal never shivered without cause. He meant to lead the horse toward the pasture to check the fence lines. But then his eyes stopped. At the edge of the snowfield, where the weak sunlight stretched in a pale ribbon, something caught him still. Elias narrowed his gaze and stepped slowly closer. There, pressed into the white, were footprints. Enormous. They sank deep, sharp, and fresh as if laid only moments before. Twice the length of a man's foot. Perhaps more. Each one set straight, steady, without a hint of faltering. Elias dropped to one knee, tugged off a glove, and pressed his calloused hand into the nearest track. It disappeared inside. The cold burned into his skin, but he did not pull away. His flesh shivered with goose flesh. Not a man. He whispered, his voice rough with disbelief. He had tracked grizzlies, followed wolves, even deer in deep snow. But no animal left a shape like this. Bears left wide, uneven prints, claws raking the snow. But here he saw heel-arch length, the stride of something walking on two legs with purpose, certain of where it was going. Behind him, the horse snorted, reins pulled taut. Elias turned to see its wide eyes restless, reflecting the pale morning light. He stroked its mane, then rose slowly to his feet. His gaze followed the trail as it wound into the pines, where the forest swallowed all with its dark, heavy silence. For a moment, Elias could hear his own heartbeat louder than the wind. He was no stranger to the stories told back in town tales whispered over whiskey of giants in the forest. Creatures hidden in fog, seen and gone like ghosts. They gave them many names: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Watcher in the woods. Elias had always laughed at such talk. Legends didn't keep cattle fed. Legends didn't keep a woman from leaving a cold cabin behind. But now, staring at the tracks before him, that old laugh felt brittle, breaking apart like thin ice beneath his feet. Something in him urged forward. He led the horse, close eyes fixed on the trail. The prince carried him across the snowy meadow, around the roots of old pines, through thickets bent and broken as though something great had walked straight through. Then he saw them, long, coarse strands of black hair caught on the damp bark. Elias pinched them between his fingers, lifting them to the gray light. Too thick for any man, too long for any bear, nothing he had ever known. A shiver crept down his spine. He drew in a sharp breath, but the cold scoured his lungs. Slipping the hairs into his coat pocket, he pressed on. Each step grew heavier, not from the snow, but from the sense he was crossing an unseen line where truth and legend blurred together. The trail ended at a rock glazed in ice. Beyond it, a wall of fog clung to the forest, swallowing the weak morning sun. Elias stood there listening. Silence pressed close, so deep he could hear the thrum of his heart like a distant drum. He longed to turn back, to return to the cabin and the warmth of fire. But in his weary eyes another glimmer stirred curiosity, a feeling he thought had died with his wife and child. Now it rose again. Elias lingered beside the frozen rock, staring into the dark curtain of trees. No more tracks, no sound but the thin whistle of wind through the pines. Yet still, he felt it, something watching him, measuring his every move. Behind him the horse shrieked, suddenly pulling hard against the reins. Elias spun his hand, tightening by instinct on the rifle. But as swiftly as it came, the unease melted. The forest stood silent once more. Too silent. He returned to the cabin when the sun had risen high, its pale gold scattering across the glittering snow. The black strands in his pocket lay heavy, a reminder that none of it was dream. That night, Elias sat at the wooden table. The silver ring rested before him, the firelight flickering his shadow long across the wall. He turned the band between his fingers, watching the faint letters gleam, MTT. Outside, the wind howled again. And then, beneath the porch, another sound. Soft, close. Elias raised his head, eyes narrowing sharp. This time he knew he hadn't imagined it. Something was leaving its mark just beyond his cabin door. Part 2. The Thing. Beneath the porch. The sound beneath the porch still echoed in Elias's mind, even as the room filled only with the soft crackle of fire. He set the silver ring down on the table, his rough hand brushing against the rifle propped in the corner. Slowly he rose and stepped toward the door. Each board groaned under his boots in rhythm with the heavy beat of his heart. When he pulled the door open, a rush of cold wind struck his face. Moonlight spilled through ragged clouds, casting a faint silver glow across the porch. Elias looked down. On the wooden step, half buried in snow, something glimmered. He knelt, brushing the powder aside with his calloused hand. A knife appeared. Its blade was dulled, its wooden handle darkened with age, but the inscription carved into it was one Elias recognized at once: J. Turner. It was his father's knife, a keepsake Elias had carried in his early days when he first left home to carve out a life on the frontier. Years ago it was lost during a landslide swallowed by earth and time. He had long believed it gone forever. And yet, Here it was, lying on the threshold of his cabin as though some unseen hand had returned it. Elias stood frozen, his fingers tightening on the handle, his eyes fixed on the shadows before him. His body tensed, torn between running into the forest to find whoever had left it, or slamming the door and pretending none of it had happened. But he knew this was no accident. He lifted his gaze. Through the slow drifting mist that rose from the snow, the pines loomed tall and dark. Somewhere in that stillness, Elias felt eyes upon him. He saw no figure, heard no footsteps, only silence so heavy it stretched every nerve tight as a drawn string. Elias spoke into the dark, his voice rough from cold and from the fear he tried to hide. "Who's out there?" His words slipped into the trees and vanished. No answer came, only the whisper of wind through the branches carrying a low, hollow sound like distant breathing. Elias stepped back and closed the door tight. He set the knife on the table beside the silver ring. Two objects, one belonging to his long-departed father, the other to his lost wife, now lay together in the firelight. Two fragments of memory returned from the dark unbidden. That night, Elias could not sleep. Every sound outside sent him upright, his heart pounding. At times, he thought he heard slow footsteps circling the cabin. At times, he swore he saw a tall shadow flicker past the window. But when he rushed to look, there was nothing, only snow and darkness. By morning, fresh snow blanketed the valley. Elias stepped out onto the porch, and there, clear as day, were the giant tracks again. They led from the forest edge all the way to his door, stopping at the very spot where he had found the knife. Elias knelt, pressing his hand into one of the prints. The shiver came again, crawling up his spine. It was clear the creature, whatever it was, meant no harm. It had come close to his cabin. It had returned the relics. Then quietly, it had left. He rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the pine woods draped in mist. One question echoed in his mind. Why was it a warning? Some cruel jest or an offering returned. Elias clenched his hand around the memory. The knife, the ring. They were no accident. Somehow this being was forcing him to face the past, the pain he had buried deep for 17 long years. And in that moment, Elias Turner realized something new. His solitude was no longer absolute. Something vast, mysterious, and silent was out there, close, watching. Part 3. The Encounter in the Woods. That night, the full moon hung high above the mountains, spilling a pale silver light across the valley. Fog drifted thick among the pines like a curtain drawn to hide some secret. Elias Turner stood on the porch, one hand resting on his rifle, his eyes fixed on the vast darkness before him. For many nights now, memories had been delivered to his door one by one. The ring, the knife, a scrap of cloth from his son's old coat. Each piece was like a needle piercing through the years, forcing him to face the sorrow he had tried to bury. And now Elias knew it was time to meet the one who had been returning them. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, pulled his heavy coat tight, and stepped down into the snow. Following the giant tracks, Elias moved into the forest. Moonlight streamed through the branches, painting pale streaks across the ground. The silence was so deep he could hear every breath he took. Farther on, he found broken branches, signs of something massive passing through. More strands of coarse black hair clung to the bark of a pine, swaying in the night breeze. Elias touched them, then tucked them into his pocket, proof that what he saw was no illusion. And then he heard it. A sharp crack, a branch snapping somewhere ahead. Heavy, certain, unlike the steps of any small creature. Elias froze, heart hammering. Slowly, he raised the rifle, took a few steps forward, his eyes straining through the fog. And then he saw it. At the edge of a clearing bathed in moonlight stood a giant. Upright on two legs, its shoulders broad as tree trunks, its body cloaked in dark gray hair. Each breath poured out in white clouds, vanishing into the mist. Its eyes glimmered faintly, not fierce, not gentle, but steady, the gaze of a watchman. Elias stood motionless. His finger tightened on the trigger. Every hunting instinct, every survival reflex screamed at him to fire to end the threat before it came closer. But another part of him, the part that had lived 17 years in silence, the part that had learned to listen to the wind, whispered to hold. The creature did not advance. It stood still like a monument carved in mist. And then, something unexpected happened. It bent slowly, placing an object upon the snow. Moonlight caught on it. Elias squinted. A piece of cloth. He knew it at once part of his little boy's coat lost long ago in the great storm. His chest tightened. The giant lifted its head. It neither moved closer nor turned away. Instead, it lowered its gaze, dipping its head in what could only be a gesture of return. Elias's hands shook on the rifle, and then slowly, he lowered it. His voice, hoarse and trembling, slipped into the night air. "Easy. I ain't here to fight." The words drifted into the fog, and the creature's vast eyes blinked as if it heard, as if it understood. In that moment, the line between man and legend blurred to nothing. Two beings, an old rancher of the West and a creature of myth, stood face to face in the silver haze. Time seemed to stop. Elias felt the pounding of his own heart, the heavy breath of the giant, echoing through the frozen stillness. It did not come closer. It did not vanish. It simply stood, its massive shoulders casting long shadows across the snow, its deep eyes shining faintly with the light of the moon. Elias could have sworn there was no malice in that gaze. It felt like waiting. Then, with a slow tilt of its head, the creature bent once more in a gesture almost of respect. After that, it stepped back, dissolving into the curtain of fog. The massive shape faded until only the whisper of wind through the pines remained. Elias stood unmoving, his hand trembling on the rifle, but his eyes were no longer filled with fear. He did not see a threat. He saw a mystery, one that had left him a gift. The scrap of cloth lay on the snow. A relic of the past returned to him like a message. When Elias bent to pick it up, he knew this encounter would not only change one night of his life, it would change everything. Part 4, Fragments of Memory, returned. Since that night in the woods, Elias Turner lived in a strange state, half wary, half waiting. Each morning when he opened the cabin door, a quiet shiver of fear mingled with curiosity. What might be waiting under the snow today? And so it was. In the days that followed, the porch became a place of return. On the first morning, Elias found a worn wooden comb, the very one Mary had once used to smooth her chestnut hair by the fire. He held it in his hand, ran his fingers along the chipped teeth, and memory rushed in, Mary sitting beneath the lantern light, smiling softly as he clumsily untangled her hair. On the second morning, there lay a blue marble. Elias froze when he recognized it. His son's. The boy who once ran laughing across the meadow, chasing the glass bead as it sparkled in the sun. He had thought it lost forever, taken the same day the snowstorm had taken everything else. On the third morning, a rough scrap of cloth appeared, patched and frayed, the very patch Mary had once sewn into his coat after a drunken brawl with cowboys long ago. Each small thing, so simple, so ordinary, struck like a hammer against the long-closed door of memory. Elias sat at his wooden table, setting them all before him, the silver ring, his father's knife, the wooden comb, the blue marble, the patched cloth. A collection no one could wish for, yet one he never dreamed he would see again. He stared at them for hours, the firelight flickering across his faded eyes. Each piece was a shard of time, proof that once there had been warmth and wholeness before it was broken by loss. Elias did not weep. Tears had long since dried away, but his hands trembled as he touched each thing as though reaching for the warmth that lingered in them still. And deep within, a question grew louder. Why was Bigfoot doing this? If it meant only to frighten him, there were easier ways. If it wanted him gone, it could have used its strength long ago. Yet instead, it chose to return these things piece by piece, memory by memory. When night fell, Elias heard the footsteps again, slow, steady, circling the cabin, not rushed, not menacing, like a silent watchman keeping guard. He sat by the window gazing into the dark and felt a strange thing rising inside him. safety. Bigfoot was no longer a monster of legend in his eyes. It was part of the forest itself, vast, mysterious, but not necessarily a threat. More like a keeper, a guardian of memory reminding Elias that the past was never lost, only waiting to be returned. One evening, Elias sat at the table, the relics spread before him. The firelight traced every crack in the wood, every worn edge. He looked at them a long time, and then for the first time in many years he whispered aloud, "Thank you." No voice answered, only the sigh of wind through the cabin seams. But Elias knew out there in the dark something had heard. That night, he did not bolt the door tight. Instead, he left the lantern burning on the porch like a quiet signal. And in the silence, he felt it, a massive shape lingering at the forest's edge, watching, not crossing the line. Elias sat still, hand wrapped around the silver ring, his eyes turned toward that place. Between them, no words were spoken, no promise made. Only a fragile understanding that they would respect each other's boundary. And in that silence, Elias realized for the first time in 17 years, he was not truly alone. Part 5. Not every shadow brings harm. Winter had reached its harshest days. Blizzards swept through the mountains, the wind howling against the cliffs like the voices of 1,000 ghosts. Elias Turner kept the fire alive in his cabin, tending to the shivering cattle in the barn. Loneliness seemed less bitter now, for each time he looked at the keepsakes on the table, he felt a quiet presence beside him. That night the storm struck hard, rattling the windows in their frames. Elias pulled on his hat, wrapped himself in a heavy coat, and carried a lantern into the gale to check on the horses. Snow whipped in blinding sheets, the wind slicing his face raw. Amid the chaos he heard a sound that did not belong to storm or tree, a weighty, steady rhythm echoing from the woods. He turned. The lantern's glow carved a narrow circle of light, and there at the edge of the forest among the swaying pines, Bigfoot stood again. Its shape loomed tall, breath rising in clouds that twisted in the wind. The storm did not move it. Its gaze held Elias calm, unhurried, without malice. Elias froze. Instinct pulled his hand to the rifle, but slowly, deliberately, he let it fall to the snow. Each motion careful, clear, a silent vow that he would not fight. He stepped forward once, placing a bare hand over his chest. Against the howl of the storm, his voice rang out low and steady, "Not every shadow harms." The words slipped into the night, carried on the blizzard's breath, but Elias knew they had reached their mark. The giant did not move. Then slowly it lowered its head. A simple gesture, yet enough for Elias to understand. Between two strangers a bond had formed of respect. The storm still roared. Yet in that moment Elias felt no fear. He watched as the massive shape stepped back, fading into the swirling snow until it was gone among the trees. Only the cabin remained, its lantern light glowing like a lone beacon in the endless white. Elias bent, lifted the rifle, but this time, instead of clutching it tight, he leaned it gently against the porch. His hand closed around the silver ring in his pocket, the proof of love, of memory, and now of the strange truth that even a legend could return what a man had lost. That night, Elias sat by the fire, his eyes wandering far beyond the frosted window. He no longer asked why. The answer was already within him in the rare peace filling his chest. Sometimes the presence of Bigfoot was not to spread fear, but to remind man that not every shadow seeks to destroy. For the first time in 17 years, Elias Turner smiled. The legend that heals. Spring dawn crept slowly over the valley. Gentle rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist, casting a softer light across the land. Snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of damp brown earth and tender blades of green grass. After long months of white silence, the land seemed to breathe again, alive once more. Elias Turner sat on the wooden chair outside his cabin. In his hand was the silver ring, catching the early sun, glimmering with a quiet warmth. His rough, work-worn fingers trembled slightly, yet the smile at his lips was calm and peaceful. He looked across the meadow. The horses grazed with ease, now no longer restless as they had been in the dark days of winter. The soft beat of their hooves on the thawing ground echoed like the steady heartbeat of a valley that had survived the storm. Elias lifted his eyes to the forest, still standing tall in the distance, vast, silent, mysterious, as it had been for ages untold. He knew that somewhere in its hidden depths, the creature remained. It never needed to appear again. Its presence alone had already changed him. For 17 years, Elias had lived like a shadow, burying his grief beneath snow and silence. But it was Bigfoot, this legend he had once dismissed, that had stirred his memories, returning them piece by piece. Not to crush him with sorrow, but to remind him to hold them, honor them, and move forward. A soft spring wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine sap, warm, so different from the bitterness of winter. Elias tightened his hand around the ring and whispered, "Mary, I am not alone anymore." No one heard except the sky and the forest, but Elias knew somehow the words had reached where they needed to go. He stood gazing toward the shadowed trees, and for the briefest moment through the lingering mist, he thought he saw a great shape stir, then fade. Elias felt no fear. He only smiled, bowing his head as one might before a friend, or a savior. He understood. Then legends do not always bring fear. Some, quietly, can heal. Elias stepped back into his cabin. On the table lay the relics of his life, the silver ring, his father's knife, the old patch of cloth, the blue marble, the wooden comb. They were no longer wounds of the past. They were proof of a life lived and of a legend that had chosen to return, not to take. Outside, the sun rose higher, its light spreading across the valley. Elias knew his journey was not over, but he had found what he needed most, the faith that even in the deepest shadows, there is room for kindness. Closing message. In the Wild West, between shadow and legend, kindness is the bridge between man and the unknown. Do you believe some legends exist, not only to bring fear, but to heal? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of mystery and humanity from the American West.